Welcome to Feds at the Edge, the podcast from Fed Insider. This is the podcast where you can learn what's going on behind the scenes in federal information technology. Each week, we hear what public and private officials have to say about topics ranging from agile development to zero trust. Oh, don't forget to give us a review after you listen to the podcast.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. For the next hour, we'll share some insights and experiences from government and industry leaders on how they're bringing integrated solutions to a hybrid workforce. Now, employees need to work from remote locations, and IT must securely bring capabilities to the edge as robust as in the office. Now, this is even more true in deployed environments where employees and troops require the capability and security, but might not have the IT skills on site to ensure continued compliance. Employees' remote workstations may not always be connected to the organization's network, or may be connected but through a slow VPN, which presents unique challenges for maintaining a compliant environment. Now, think about working in a denied, disrupted, intermittent, and limited, or DDIL bandwidth environment that some of our remote users find themselves in. Think of the significant challenges that poses to secure compliance operations. A challenge that multiplies the complexities of hybrid environments and is very real for DoD. So let's talk the technology, programs, and security measures needed to bring integrated solutions for these challenges and achieve policy compliance with BIS's Security Technical Implementation Guide, or STIG, and Center for Information Security Standards. So let's get started. First, I'm happy to welcome Jay Bonsi, the Chief Technology Officer for the United States Air Force. And joining Jay today with perspectives from the private sector is the Vice President of SteelCloud, Nigel Hughes. With Jay and Nigel, we have Alvin Tony Plater. Tony is the Acting Chief Information Security Officer for the United States Navy. Now, before we get started, why don't each of you share a little something of your background with our audience? Jay, how about you?
Hey, thanks, Mike. My name's Jay Bonsi. I've been in the seat here in the public sector for a couple of years. And previous to that, I've been a longtime industry veteran. I grew up in open source and on the product side, delivering kind of internet scale technologies. And so I've had both a blend of public and private IT delivery experience, and including, where today we're tackling a lot of these sort of end user device and connectivity challenges for our users in the upcoming years here in the Department of the Air Force.
Well, that's great. You got a lot. You're gonna add a lot to what we're talking about today for sure. How about you, Nigel?
Hey, Mike, thank you. Yeah, hey, everybody. I'm Nigel Hughes over at SteelCloud. I'm a vice president here. A little background on me is that, first of all, I've been a lifelong West Ham United fan. And for the uninitiated, that's a Premier League football or soccer team in London. I'm also a part-time actor with Arts for All, which is an inclusive theatre group here in Northern Virginia. And this coming March, I will be playing the great and powerful in our production of The Wizard of Oz. Professionally, I go back to the days of the IBM mainframe and the 370 architectures of the early 80s, where I was a systems analyst back in England. Over the years, I've worked with organizations like Micro Focus and their COBOL compiler technologies. I've worked with some microsystems where we were rehosting mainframe application infrastructure onto these Unix platforms, and joined SteelCloud about 15 years ago. As many of you probably know, SteelCloud is a cybersecurity software company, and we specialize in STIG and CIS compliance for RMF readiness automation. Our software is deployed extensively across the defense and civilian agencies of our government, including the Air Force ITAS program, which is the Wave 1 initiative, and we are ramping up for some 700,000 Windows 10 workstation deployment there. I'm very glad to be here today.
Outstanding. Well, it's good to have you here today. And Tony, finally, how about you?
It's great to be here. Great to join you and Nigel and Jay. As you mentioned, I'm Department of Navy CISO, so it's quite a endeavor, quite a journey. As you think about Department of Navy, please think about multinational air, land, sea, and space operational areas, and we definitely live the mission of DDIL, of having limited bandwidth, limited communications. My journey, I bring Army, active duty, retired with a lot of IT experience from that perspective, and then joined industry for about 12 years as a technologist specialist, supporting the Navy. And then the Department of Navy finally said, hey, why don't you come over and be a government civilian? So I have been living that journey for the last 9 years, and fortunate and humbled to be the CISO for the last 2.5 years. So glad to be here, glad to be part of this conversation.
Well, heck, that's a heck of a journey. I mean, Army, private sector, government civilian, now the CISO for the Navy. You kind of covered all the bases there. That's outstanding. Well, for our audience, if you want to see more of our speakers, their bios are online. Just go ahead and click on the tab and take a look at them. But first of all, thanks to all of you for joining us today, and thanks to our audience for joining us. Initially, I'm going to ask my questions to one of you. But, if any of you have any thoughts, please jump right in. If you're like me, if you wait for a second, poof, it'll blow out of your mind. You won't remember it. So jump right in if you have any thoughts. Jay, we're going to kick it off with you. Departments, agencies, and organizations are tackling bringing integrated capabilities to the edges of their networks. Are there compliance benefits that they can realize from implementing maybe a portable cloud network solution at the edge of their environment to provide transparent deployed and headquarters environments?
Yeah, so the environment today, as we're moving towards zero trust, is there is not going to be an on-premise anymore. That's the ultimate dream, right? Not being connected to an intranet. And many corporations have already gone down this road in the private sector, and we are making steps to do so in the public sector. And between the different military departments, we're at different parts along our journey, depending on the places where we've sort of prioritized and put our money. The places where we feel like at the Air Force, where it's been really a strong place to invest, are around our end user device management platforms, and some of looking towards cloud-based XDR solutions. And that would allow us to make sure that we have a secured and managed endpoint using fully accredited cloud-based tools. So whether or not a person is working remotely from their home, or you're working from a base, as long as that internet connectivity or direct cloud connectivity is there, then we're able to make sure it's patched all the way, to make sure that there is no sort of anomalous endpoint activity. And so we're really looking to that, not only just for the compliance of making sure that we have a good managed image, things like making sure that we have at-rest encryption on the devices, et cetera, but also real strong security benefits of having that management and not requiring somebody to come back in and make sure you're plugged into the Active Directory. So I think you'll see more and more that we reduce our dependence on management through Active Directory type solutions, and we'll probably see more in the cloud space. And the industry, I think, is moving in that direction as well, to make most of those types of solutions less on-premise and more backed by the cloud.
So you think, okay, so it's really interesting, though, the device management from the outside is so important that you are able to recognize, identify that device, and actually basically certify it on your network. And that way, if something that is external to what you are under control or have device security over, it can be basically blocked out of your network. Is that right?
Yeah. And as we look towards things like conditional access, where you have to combine not only the identity of the person, but also the health of the device that you're connecting on, and whether or not it's a managed or unmanaged device, and how you kind of structure the policy around the circumstances for which you would allow unmanaged devices, that gives you a high level of assurance that you are interacting in a way that doesn't have adversarial intent or malicious intent in the middle. So I think it's going to be a challenge, because this is an integration of a lot of different systems that we don't tend to take as an integrated view today. And oftentimes people who are protecting applications are not the ones who are deploying endpoints. And so it's going to be a big whole of organization effort to pull all of these threads together.
You're dead on right there. Nigel, go ahead.
Yeah, just to add to what Jay's saying there, he's absolutely right. And of course, zero trust is going to very much come into play in the coming weeks and months. I think if that asset comes onto the network and perhaps it hasn't been there for 30 days, it may need to be quarantined. And so we need to make sure that not only are we meeting all of the connectivity requirements, but also, has that asset been tampered with? Do we need to verify the compliance posture before we permit it on the network, that kind of thing?
Well, it's part of the constant monitoring also, right, Nigel, that you don't just validate and verify something the first time and just let it remain on the network, but we're continuously monitoring and looking at it and checking its credentials and making sure that it basically hasn't been hijacked somewhere along the way.
Indeed, yeah, and to ensure that the policy posture remains current so that it is indeed protected from some of these kinds of situations.
Outstanding. So, Nigel, let's stay with you. In the austere environment of deployed operating sites, there can be a myriad of issues not necessarily faced at more permanent sites. So in your experience, what are some common issues that adversely impact compliance with STIGs in a hybrid environment, especially one that might include operational deployments?
Yeah. Well, STIGs, of course, are the common denominator for all of this infrastructure, right? Everything must be locked down in accordance with those STIGs to the highest level possible. As Jay alluded, a lot of this is about accessibility. With these remote assets where they're coming in through VPNs, as you alluded, Mike, oftentimes we don't even know when they're on the network for things like routine patching and that kind of thing. So when we look to scan them or remediate them, that could be for a simple update to a baseline or to just scan for a current posture. We're often struggling with if the asset is indeed accessible at that time. And so we tend to focus on doing this centrally, and we're reaching out across all of these different assets, across different time zones, and we're often unable to reach the assets because of where they're located or because they're simply not on the network. So what I think is a better model is to explore how a local agent at that particular asset level can handle all of these processes locally, even if it's not connected to the network.
That's incredible. Okay, so we're going to move on. Tony, what are some ways for keeping up with implementation of quarterly STIGs as put out by the Department of Defense Information Systems Agency?
So as you talked about, STIGs set the foundation for a secure posture. And I would note that, there's STIGs for about everything, for the operating systems, the applications, et cetera. We frequently work with DISA when they go to develop STIGs for new capabilities that come out. But the important, because we want to make every effort to mitigate risk. We do not want the capability to be just deployed. We want our defenses to be configured correctly and effectively to mitigate risk. So I think you will agree that keeping up with the implementation of STIGs released is pivotal for our security posture and supportive of zero trust. I tend to get away from the word compliance because I feel that as we deploy a security capability, we're trying to make sure it's current and it's effective against the adversary. So it is about currency on our network and making sure our defenses are working. So when I think about when do we implement STIGs, I think typically for us, we implement during routine maintenance schedules and we can schedule downtime. There are even cases where operational requirements impact when STIGs will be applied. So how do I manage STIGs? From many of the tools we use today, many parts of the Navy uses eMaster, which was a tool that was developed by our Naval Surface Warfare Center, Panama Division, to support validation and verification. We use Vulnerability Remediation Asset Manager, which is VRAM. It enables us to monitor and track compliance of information assurance vulnerability actions. This reduces some of that labor-intensive manual end user processes from cross-referencing scanning results with approved patches. But as part of our modernization and delivering value to customers, we're always seeking ways to be more efficient and effective in validating our configuration with minimal impact to the mission.
Yeah,
That's interesting. Go ahead, Nigel.
I was just going to say, I think what you just described is what we see, almost through every enclave. The quarterly updates are critically important to maintaining the highest level of security, and that does come from compliance oftentimes. The process, though, is very disruptive. It's very time consuming, and sometimes it's a little fraught with risk of making mistakes. It's also a very manual process. I think you talk to all of the different tools that you use, and that's part of the problem. We see it day in, day out, where people are applying STIG policies using things like GPOs, there's playbooks, there's all kinds of scripts. There's things, proprietary products like Puppet Chef and a bunch of others. What they all have in common is that they're partial. They're sort of disparate capabilities. And what you have to do is think about some sort of a kludge of all of these different approaches to get to some modicum of compliance. And then, of course, beyond compliance, it's about accreditation. And you mentioned EMAS, and I think that's really important too. We have to accredit these systems. We have to then sustain them and be in readiness for the next quarterly update.
So, okay, but Tony, you also talked about these tools that were to automate, or you're starting to automate the functions, the capability of implementing STIGs. And the tools also sound like they're probably not just being used for STIGs, right? You're using them throughout your environment.
That's correct. I mean, because again, the ultimate goal is, right, in support of Zero Trust and all our other efforts, is not just to have capability out there. It's to make sure the capability is accurately deployed, configured, and effective. And I have to just continue to foot stomp. It's about making sure our tools, how effective are they? So we're also complementing much of what we do with secure validation tools and threat emulation assessments. So one of the big things I'm pushing is, to broaden the threat emulation tools and our assessments we do across our network, because we've deployed the tools, we've STIG'd the tools, but I also want to know how effective are they against the known threat TTPs. So all that plays into it. And then we couple that with what Jay had talked about earlier, our Zero Trust efforts and our micro segmentation and all our lockdown. Then we start to think more holistically across the board that we have protections and insight across our networks.
Yeah, that's outstanding, because it's what Nigel and Jay and you all have been referring to is, one, it can be difficult if you don't implement automated capabilities, and it's time consuming, but also the integration of all of this together, bringing it together, is so incredibly important to everything that we're doing. So thanks.
I 100% agree. Automation, anytime we can automate, is a good day. So yeah, manual intensive, no new resources. We want our folks to be able to be out there doing the mission. So these efforts, automation plays a big key.
One thing I'll add to that around the automation too is that to get that automation correct also helps you streamline your warehousing of things like end user devices, right? So you don't want to have to be in this place where you have to keep warm like a small warehouse of like 200 imaged laptops. Right, we're moving towards a system where we can just drop ship laptops from an OEM, and with the right configuration, with the right set of cloud tools, they can kind of bootstrap into that assured configuration. We're not there yet, but that's the dream, right? We want to have it so that the supply chain elements get pushed from the Air Force closer towards the OEMs, so that we don't have to, keep a bunch of money tied up in laptop spares.
And that's really, Jay, that's great, because that's kind of leading us right into your next question that I had for you. And also the fact that, that we were talking about the deployed capabilities and denied disrupted environment capabilities, and how do we keep them up to date. So what are your top concerns for security of tactical-based systems on base, in the field, or even post-deployment? And what are some methods to ensure that the systems are being deployed into the field are secure and have the same security compliance levels as those in garrison?
So one of the things that we've learned over the last year is that typically there is this concept broadly of DDIL, right? Where, you have the denied, disconnected, latent type systems, but there are different flavors of DDoS. And this matters because each different flavor of DDoS has a slightly different set of interactions with a broader or richer enterprise service. So if one version of DDoS is you're going to get disconnected from time to time. Maybe you're in a remote overseas area and the link is a little bit shaky and you're down for a couple minutes. There are places where you may have to have something be portable and you're down for a couple of hours. And then there is the DDoS where, okay, no, seriously, you're going to live off the land in a very disconnected state, and you're going to be dark for days on end. And you have to think about both so the first two categories where you're having disconnectivity, the enterprise can still service those folks. And so, it's just a matter of making sure that your policies are set to a reasonable combination. You don't have to be up to the minute on patches, but you want to make sure they can get out there in a reasonable amount of time for your bandwidth and some of the performance implications of that. For things that are further afield, you're going to have to come up with alternate kind of scanning and remediation type elements to be able to take a look at those type of capabilities. But for us, really, we like to think about it as sort of the Maslow's hierarchy of AI, and the bottom plank of that is going to be resilient comms. And so an increasing focus on resilient comms as a baseline for this to reduce the impact of DDoS. It's not like financially feasible to field a whole stack of services to service disconnected locations in a real way, at least not for us in the Air Force, where our bases are very rich power projection platforms. And so moving to a focal area of saying like, okay, no, actually the most important thing is to get that comm link back up so the enterprise can service it with rich services is an area that we are very much leaning into. So when you think about how that also works with your compliance elements, you start to get into things like secure mobility. So there are a number of vendors and integrators who have put together commercial solutions for classified type mobility offerings, and making sure that those stay up to date with the registration and patching. There are very strict guidelines about how that has to work. And so there's a lot in it depending on what goes into those elements. But, for us, because it's difficult to maintain good technologically rich tactical solutions, making sure that connectivity back to the enterprise as much as possible exists.
Hey, Jay, I really like what you said there, and that I fully subscribe to that. I think we've got to provide a capability that is secure. And what we oftentimes think about, when you were talking about like a warehouse of kind of like warm laptops that we can kind of deploy at a moment, but we tend to keep doing this centrally, where we're going from our enclave, where we're pushing policy out to these assets. And obviously we need a communication to be able to do that. What I think where industry is heading, and certainly where we're looking to, is to look at agent-based implementations of security policy, where indeed all of that policy is maintained locally on an agent for each of those assets, right? So if you have, as you mentioned, a laptop in a sort of situation where you have a battlefield kind of situation, that device needs to be in compliance, but obviously the mission comes first. The ability to be able to scan and to remediate itself to stay in compliance, I think is critical to the ongoing protection of those devices. And then when that connection is made, that device can simply provide all of the compliance reports it created while it was offline, and indeed connect and accept any new updates to the security policy. And that's very much consistent with zero trust as well, so that we're maintaining these assets at the highest possible levels of compliance.
I would agree. I would say that having agent-based compliance features is not at all sort of incompatible with sort of strong central support, right? So that's a good compromise. Right. So you don't want local control over policies, because then you get sort of policy skew. So like a good central bank of security best practices that work for 99% of missions, and then enforced locally with kind of richer client type solutions, whether or not it's, a comply to connect client or, an XDR client or something that's built in like that. I think that's 100% the right pattern.
So, you both bring up some good points. And Nigel, this actually bleeds right into your next question also. And as a matter of fact, it actually directed it a lot of it. Possibly you can add to it. So what are the biggest challenges to maintaining continual compliance in a denied, disrupted, intermittent, and limited bandwidth and garrison hybrid environment?
Yeah, I think, there's three things there. I guess two sort of main problems, and that's the sort of intermittent and limited bandwidth. We know with many of our partners that they encounter a lot of multi-hop VPNs, a lot of SATCOM, and it can take too long. For example, a scan on a local network can just take a few moments, whereas through a SATCOM, it could take hours. And so, accessibility, I think, is a key part of it. And I come back to the idea of what I would call a semi-autonomous agent that can manage these things locally and then provide connectivity to the central sort of policy updates. Now, I do think that what we're seeing is the hybrid environments present challenges for accessibility and just the capacity of those networks. That's the number one thing that we hear from our partners all the time is, I just do not have the capacity to get on the network, which means that it's very difficult for those assets to be reached for any kind of scanning or any remediation of those baseline policies.
So also, we're looking at the SATCOM updates across SATCOM, especially if you have multiple missions that are going on simultaneously. If everybody's utilizing those networks and utilizing those channels on a SATCOM connectivity, how do you do updates going across it? I mean, you mentioned hours. It could actually be longer than that, couldn't it?
Yeah, it really can, depending on the capacity there. And the way that we handle that with SteelCloud is we have the capability to be able to do this work from the device. We have the ability to, on a schedule, be able to scan the asset to determine the policy posture for all of those STIGs. And as Jay indicated, some of those STIGs are applications, they're browsers, their firewalls, their databases, and what have you, and they all have to be maintained in this level of compliance. And so with a local capability to be able to have all of those baselines, if there is any drift at the local asset, they can be snapped back into compliance immediately. And then when that VPN or that SATCOM connection is reestablished, they can provide those compliance reports to the host centralized management system and also be able to receive any new updates to those base configurations. So what we're trying to do here is get to a very high level of policy compliance and then maintain that. We talked earlier about like the quarterly updates occurring, and that's fine. But if there's drift, if somebody locally has what they think is a better idea for a configuration, we need to be able to snap that back into the proper level of compliance in order to protect that asset.
Those are all very good points. And Tony mentioned something earlier that I'll come back to is the scheduled maintenance windows that are thrown in there. That's got to be a big help because that's one time where you can shut everything else off and only focus on the updates and maintaining compliance at that point in time. But a lot of times that can't happen if the mission's going on.
Yeah, and Tony's absolutely right. If we have an opportunity to take some downtime, great. But these policy updates, these changes should be able to be done in a production environment. They should not impact the operation of the infrastructure, is our experience.
Okay, outstanding. Tony, brings us right to you. We're talking about the complexity and the hardships of doing this. Complexity of integrated solutions at the edge can be problematic, to say the least. So how important is interoperability across the different solutions to preventing DoD, or basically anyone for that matter, from getting vendor lock-in?
No, very good question. Matter of fact, I'm sitting at the NIST Center of Excellence today, So they're hosting me. And we are here talking about interoperability and standards and what they're doing in the Zero Trust Lab and what we're finding with different industry solutions, and really talking a lot about how the solutions have to work together, and we have to have common data needs, and how those common data needs, regardless of what the solution, what the vendor is, goes to meet our needs. So understanding the complexity of these integrated solutions at the edge can indeed pose significant challenges. So interoperability across the different solutions is critical to the Department of Navy, DoD, and the other services. And matter of fact, any organization from falling victim to vendor lock-in. So we want to make sure we create that flexibility, whether you're coming from one cloud provider or the other cloud provider, and us being able to meet our mission. So ensuring interoperability helps us to mitigate that risk associated with relying too heavily on one single vendor, and making sure we have flexibility, we can address cost, and we can also address potential security vulnerabilities. So we're looking to promote that interoperability, to enable that integration of diverse technologies of systems, and to allow for seamless communication. But by embracing interoperability, I think DoD and the Department of Navy ultimately has greater agility, and will be able to avoid that lock-in and ensure long-term sustainability.
So if I could actually kind of pile in on that, I don't actually think lock-in in this ecosystem is the actual kind of core of the problem. I think in general, when we look at the Zero Trust ecosystem, there are a number of products that don't have sort of open standards. So software-defined perimeter, endpoint protection, SASE is a little bit more standardizable. But what you end up having is, we have the very practical situation of having, Air Force policy enforcement points having to determine whether or not a Navy laptop is up to spec. And so only the Navy knows if they're the ones managing that laptop. And unless we were to all go all in on like single vendor solutions in like a single tenant environment, there's no way for me to adjudicate the health of that device. And so whether or not like I have a particular solution or the Navy has a particular solution or the Army, it's not a matter of being sort of locked into that vendor, because we can pretty easily swap if we have the right data. It's a matter of being able to understand how we can kind of query between sibling services in like an enterprise of enterprises fashion. And so that type of interoperability work is not supported by the product field today. And I don't think that, in a practical timeline over the next few years, like some kind of standard is going to emerge. So we're going to have to find some kind of interoperability API or some way that we can apply an integration layer over those vendors provided solutions and kind of bring the vendor field along with us. It's going to be it's a very practical challenge that we're running into when we're starting to go down our Zero Trust journey. Like it's very obviously we're going to stub our toe in this in like 6 months.
I always thought, and I always looked for when I was in your shoes, basically like in a position like you, Jay, is that I wanted to look for basically to be able to play vendor roulette, and that I could go to any vendor I wanted to at any time, and be able to take the products that they offered and used, and be able to plug it into my solution and plug it into my situation, and have the feeling confident that it would work and play well with the others in the sandbox. That's, I think, is what you're getting at across the services also. Am I right?
Sort of. So when you look at those solutions in practical terms, you can plug it into all of your integration points, right? But you have a number of external to you integration points that get very complicated very quickly, right? And so for instance, like if we choose vendor A for our platform protection solution, Navy chooses vendor B, and they want to choose to vendor C, then we have to change all of our Go Ask Navy rules to be pointed at something else. And so it's not just internal to a particular enterprise deployment, it's also having to have that abstraction layer, and that abstraction layer is where the challenges are going to arise. And and we've had conversations with the CTOs and CIOs of the services to try and like focus in on thinking about how we're going to solve this. But it's a challenge that still lies in front of us.
I'd have to foot stomp what Jay was saying. It is about understanding our data needs when it comes down to understanding what's going on in the network, being able to make those decisions. And we will have to interoperate. There will be different environment, different tools. So it all comes down to the data. So that's why I like when we talk about zero trust, we're really talking about securing the data, and a lot of discussion on what is that telemetry? What are those data requirements so we can continue to drive forward? So therefore we can get out of, roulette and not understanding what's going on the network.
Outstanding. Okay, great. So here comes a question I've really been looking forward to asking. Jay, you're going to get it. Is both reserves and active duty personnel often connect from home these days. So what are some common obstacles to securely connecting a home workstation or remote device that you've encountered, and what tools are available to address them?
So when somebody's connecting in from today, we oftentimes use VPN, just classic virtual private networking. And, there are two sort of scenarios. So you have a GFE, or corporately provided device, government first equipment, to get out of the acronym soup, something that, the Army or the Air Force hands you a laptop, and that's your corporate laptop. And that's one way of connecting. The other way is sort of an unmanaged device, a bring your own device perspective. So we'll kind of split those in two. In the government furnished equipment, sort of corporate laptop perspective, those have a VPN, which is usually supposed to check the compliance of your machine before it lets you connect into the network. And that's usually a part of the VPN client in the sort of integrated solution that the enterprise puts forward. It should be no different than your on-premise configuration, but they are today two different systems, right? So we treat intranets and VPNs as having a slightly different rule set today for how people come in. And we're looking to unify that set of rules more and more in the future. There's also some considerations about how your domain works, your Windows domain, which is typically a part of that GFE situation. On the bring your own device side, there are a number of existing situations and existing implementations of risk postures for certain mission systems that allow people to connect to DoD information systems from a personal device, right? And so the collaboration ecosystem allows it today. There are certain things such as training websites that have said, hey, it's more important to let people take training from home, especially for like Guard and Reserve units, those infrequently connected folks, to be able to just take, because maybe we don't want to have to hand them a piece of equipment for them to manage. And so you can just sort of take those things from a home computer. So we, on the bring your own device side, you have to really consider what the risk is of the data that you're putting out into the world, and whether or not you can still require strong authentication, right? So most home computers do have DoD PKI support that you can pretty quickly get them into. But really, is there risk of data loss in some way, right? And if you're just dealing with like your training data, that's probably pretty low risk, and that's why those missions have chosen to accept it. But if you're dealing with, say, for instance, like controlled and classified information in any real way, you probably you as a mission system would probably not make that decision. And so it's a mixture of both sort of technology and the framing of your policies to make it to sort of make the right decision for your mission set.
It's complicated to say the least. Tony, how would you look at it from the Navy side?
I have to compliment. I mean, I think Jay hit on it. I mean, we're the additional things we're doing is with Flank Speed is our implementation of our unclassified Microsoft 365 cloud version. I think that is providing us. We're somewhere in the area of 500,000 plus seats that we've deployed. I think that is helping us to address some of the issues, because we started out looking at a zero trust focused approach when we implemented it. And then when I started thinking about remote work, I started thinking about the virtual desktop that I mentioned earlier. So we're really getting to now about 50,000 seats provision on that. And that's helping us with our phones, our devices, et cetera, and providing that secure environment that still goes out to those platforms that are used by those remote workers. So we're really seeing a lot of interest in that. And we're starting to test managed apps We're still in a testing stage when it comes down to being managed apps specifically on personal phones. So these are the areas we're really trying to get after, which have been, really propelled ever since we increased remote work due to the epidemic. So we've kind of leveraged that as a big catapult on how we need to modernize our networks. And that modernization is addressing remote work and offering improved security.
It really sounds like you're getting the security down to the data level, microsegmentation, microsegmentation, whatever. And that is the route that you're taking on this, is secure at the data and program level, not necessarily and thereby being able to secure the device also. Am I right?
That's where we want to go, right? There's a lot of, let's say, big discussions. Again, a lot of complexity comes in, as we talked about. But I think there's agreement that we're all moving in that direction with a focus on getting to the data level, having decisions made where we know who is accessing the data, who the users are, we know who the devices are, and we'll be able to make those decisions, as was talked about earlier, using multiple attributes to make sure we're ensuring and securing the data.
Yeah, I think you're right. The data is critical, and then the access, the comply to connect issues, the compliance, authentication, all of that is kind of tied into the zero trust platform and all of the NAC products that there are out there that manage all of that. So we see a lot of the challenges that you speak to there, Tony, and I think with some of our National Guard deployments where there are oftentimes very limited bandwidth, and then there are shared assets where there are part-time people that have multiple profiles and user profiles and things like that add to the complexity of those types of devices.
Nigel, this kind of leads into your next question is, how does the migration of applications and data to a hybrid multi-cloud environment impact data and network security in a deployed or even a hostile field environment? Or could this be problematic for the overall STIG compliance capability?
Yeah, I mean, the STIG compliance requirements remain the same, right? Whether the asset is on-prem, in a data center, or in a cloud. Of course, we see hundreds of hybrid deployments where there's typically, say, server infrastructure that may be deployed as AMIs in an AWS infrastructure. Oftentimes, many of the sort of workstation LANs and some of the remote hybrid workers then are accessing through VPNs and all of these different things. The STIG requirements remain the same for every component on the network, be it a switch, a router, a server, a workstation, whatever it may be. It still has to be in compliance. And then it's really a case of how do we access these devices? We talked a little bit about being able to reach out to these assets. And of course, we never oftentimes know when they're on the actual network. So where we approach these is have that ability to be able to attach to the asset to be able to determine the posture of where it's in compliance and where it's not, and then be able to address that. Some of the things that make a big difference across these disparate environments are STIGs can break things. One size does not fit all. I think many of us know that. And so the ability to be able to harden around things, to be able to create content that allows things to operate, to have built-in waivers, I think is a big part of that.
I would also kind of add in that the real elephant in the room here is a lot of cloud-based things, like STIGs don't work fully for at all, right? So if you move to an entirely platform as a service infrastructure, there's no endpoint scanning because there's no real endpoint to get to. And so, as we move more towards cloud, we're going to have to come up with new ways to secure data and workloads that are that may be more about container hardening and less about, even if you get down to that functional level for certain types of these platforms, it may be more about just watching the API access points and not worrying about endpoint protection at all.
Yeah, I think on some of the container-based systems, you're right, Jay. What we're seeing is, if you establish a Windows Server configuration as an AMI in AWS or some sort of instance in Azure, the stick compliance remains the same.
Oh, you can certainly do it for an AMI, yes, for managed images like that.
Yeah, for some of those images, the images themselves have to be deployed in stick compliance, of course, and then what you're doing is you're propagating them en masse, within the container. So that's I think there is still an obligation, albeit it's diminished in as much as that image is subject to frequent change. It can be even quite transient, but the initial deployment must be in stick compliance still. Yes.
Well, heck, this conversation kind of throws a wrinkle in the question I'm about to ask Tony. Tony, how can you automate stick compliance to provide IT professionals more time to tackle the ever increasing cyber threats?
So I think, we kind of hit and reiterate a couple things we talked about earlier, at least from the perspective that we're, the tools we're using, as I talked about earlier, the eMaster, where, we have our virtual, our VRAM solution, which kind of gives us now is trying to move that labor from our sailors and Marines to tools that help automate and give us that visibility and oversight. And it's also been talked about, it's bringing all this capability together. Comply to Connect's been talked about a lot. Zero Trust has been talked about a lot. So bringing the interoperability of these two, the interoperability of the industry tools, all of that goes to what we're trying to do as far as automating our network, being able to validate what's out there. And currently, those are the solutions we're looking at, but we're looking for continuously relooking our solutions to see what we can divest of and what we need, where we need to make investments in order to do that automation.
Tony, I think you're absolutely right. Automation is key here, right? I think what we've got to do is move away from a kind of a find and fix model. That's what we see day in, day out, where organizations are scanning assets. The A&A folk are coming up with a truckload of findings. Those findings typically have to be worked through the solution owners, the applications folk, the database people, to remediate those findings. What we should be instead doing, I think, is having automation where we have automated self-healing deployments. What I think we're seeing across many of the G6s, across the various branches of the military, is there's a demand, I think, for automation. They're looking at requirements for operationalization of these processes, right? So what we want to do is get to the point where an asset is brought into compliance, and then it's maintained in compliance as a routine update. It's not a fire drill. It's not something where everyone's running around with their hair on fire. It's a routine, natural process that is completely automated, and there are zero defects. Okay, that's where I think we've got to get to, and I think that's the way we're heading.
And if I could, that's why, I really like what we're doing with virtual desktop, because again, we're talking about infrastructure as code. And then as we see a need to make those security updates, we're able to do that. And we're able to do it instantaneously and without impact to the end user. So we kind of we're starting to see where we need to move away from hardware GFE, where we move to these virtual desktop and virtual solutions, because from a security perspective, it's giving me much more flexibility and the ability to provide a service, but provide it in a more secure fashion. So getting back to what you said, understanding what the configuration looks like, being able to validate their configuration, but also being able to have the agility to make changes.
That's outstanding. Great conversation here. So, Jay, we're moving on. How do deployed small tactical warfighting teams gain access to immediate IT resources when they're in the field, or even, I know your Air Force, but in Tony's Navy, but even in a sea environment, or even space for that matter?
Our way to get access to IT resources in a sea environment is to ask the Navy. Nice. That's our official strategy. In reality, we have to be able to make sure that our operators have the tools that they need, that we have the right training on that side so that those folks can be able to deploy the solution. So they have to be easy. They have to have a user experience, not necessarily that they love, but that will get them to get their job done, and really push out a proceduralized way so that you can make things ruggedizable and field repairable as much as humanly possible. So when you're in kind of austere locations, it does take a lot of planning and coordination with your expeditionary comm community and the folks who are supporting kind of IT focused missions. There are some things that we want to make available in the future. So things like having good zero client support, right? Where you've got something where where you'll be able to, if a thicker client fails, that you have at least a fallback option to be able to connect. There are lots and lots of options that we're looking at as we look to centralize, but only centralize in so much that we could provide a more robust, more well thought out service to what goes on at the edge.
So the resources that we're talking about actually for deployed forces also in the field, do they reach back? Do they bring it with them? Is it a mixture, a hybrid mixture of both?
It's going to be a hybrid mixture, and so what we found is that you have to really look where your data is going to be, right? And in increasingly data hungry missions, sometimes you're attached to your source of data like a sensor or a data link, but by and large, you're going to be collaborating with the joint service and increasingly coalition partners. So that resilient connectivity that I talked about before, that sort of base level of the pyramid, is huge to make sure that they can stay connected and really go after the pure automation of that PACE plan, so that and so that we can connect with any source of connectivity available, right? Even if it's a cell phone, and how do you overlay the proper security in order to be able to make that work?
Okay.
The devices that we see, be it an aircraft or a frigate, there's a lot of OT infrastructure in these types of deployments, and they're often legacy based. They're Windows XP, and they present their own unique challenges to be able to access those systems.
Well, it's not just that. The OT, I mean, it used not to be a part of the IT network. I mean, we weren't concerned about it, but it is now. And especially, as you said, in some cases, you're talking a 20, 30, 40, in some cases, even a 40-year-old platform, okay, that the OT might be quite outdated in it. And the fact that information is running over an IT network, and now the CIOs, the CTOs, and the CISOs are responsible for that information and the security of that, it makes it even more difficult. So, yeah, absolutely. Nigel, we're moving to you. We're constantly striving to improve our cybersecurity compliance. So what metrics do we use to measure the effectiveness of our improvements? And how do CCRIs impact the effectiveness?
All right. Well, yeah, compliance allows us, obviously, to improve our cybersecurity. The metrics, though, I think they tend to oftentimes be days, weeks, or never. Whereas they should be immediate. They should be minutes, hours at best. When we look at CCRIs, they're back in vogue. We had a COVID hiatus, and now they're happening everywhere. The various commands and squadrons and deployments that we speak to, they're all getting ready for the dreaded CCRI. Now, a big part of this, of course, is that all of these people have their regular day job, and now they have to kind of get ready for the CCRI and all of the potential findings. And people take some pretty drastic steps to try and avoid the close scrutiny that these represent. And so what we have to be mindful of, I think, is, can we get to a CCRI where there are, in fact, no findings? That, as you probably know, these CCRIs are typically conducted by DISA themselves. They can be a bit of a surprise to any given command or enclave. Oftentimes, they are anticipated in as much as we're expecting it in June next year. So there's a lot of readiness that they need to do. And for many organizations, they are simply not ready. We're often brought in anticipation of the CCRI so that at least all the findings can be identified. They can also be remediated, or sometimes in the wake of a CCRI where the findings are pretty damning and we need to indeed remediate all of those and lock down the infrastructure correctly. So I think when we look at things like ATOs, RMF accreditations, they're a constant, right? The metrics are finite, but we must also maintain these high levels of compliance in order to really allow our cybersecurity to have a fundamental baseline that you can build everything else that Tony and Jay have been talking about.
And if I could compliment what Nigel just said, yeah, I agree. But I think for me, thinking as a CISO and Department of Navy, we want to move forward beyond compliance to readiness, right? So it goes exactly what you said. We have to figure a way to get away from that workup to a CCRI, because the adversary is not on the same schedule, right? So they're not going to wait till, we're ready in three to 4 months for the CCRI. So a lot of thought, planning, and work is ongoing now under what we call Cyber Ready, to recognize we need to have a state of currency, that you have to be earning your ATO every day, and that are we employing the right automated tools to give us that near-term visibility of what's happening on the network. So all of it does equate to more automation, looking for the right automation, the right telemetry, the right data coming in, so that we practice each and every day on understanding what our network posture looks like, as I talked about earlier. Deploy it, configure it, test it, know where you stand, and when it comes down to these TTPs, so that we have more. So when a CCRI is talked about in the future, which we are working with DISA and wanting more threat-informed CCRIs, that we know that our networks are actually performing and our security posture is ready.
It's really interesting, and we only have a couple of minutes, so we'll turn to final thoughts in just a second, but I wanted to add on to what you're saying, Tony. I think we're actually a lot better off today than we were, say, a couple of years ago. I think the currency and as you say, I love that state of currency is much better than it was before, because of the fact that the leadership is knowledgeable now. They see the threat, they see the need for the security and for the network security and for the CISO's operations and what they're doing, and they're fully supporting it these days, which is great. With that, I need to turn to final thoughts. We're about to wrap up. We only have a couple of minutes. Jay, any final thoughts you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, I would say that broadly, to look at this, the challenge for deploying each of these solutions is, on the government side at least, is having really strong government pre-integration, is to really think through how all the components need to come together, find the right partners to pull it together. But increasingly, as we move to a zero trust world, each of these things touch everything else in new and novel ways. And it requires a lot more system planning. You don't just have end user device guys, and you don't just have a mobile team, and you just don't have a cloud team. And so this all has to work together now to be able to have kind of an integrated, secure solution. Because previously the network was the thing that tied everything together. And as we reduce the importance and the strangely interconnectedness of the corporate network, that's where we're going to end up being in the future. So do the homework and find the right partners.
Great, thanks. And Nigel, how about you?
Yeah, first of all, I've really enjoyed getting together with everyone. Tony and Jay have been very insightful, and it's wonderful to hear their thinking on the way the industry should be going. So we're listening very intently here. As a vendor, we're obviously Steel Cloud. What we've done is we've productized what DISA publishes for all of the STIGs. We also do the exact same thing for all of the CIS benchmarks. And this means the industry is better placed to meet these requirements. And indeed, for all of our DoD customers, they're able to take those DISA baselines and create their own custom implementations of those STIGs, deploy them en masse, and then maintain them with the least ongoing touch with all of these sort of self-healing characteristics. So people listening, I'd encourage you to go to our website at steelcloud.com and check us out. We'd love to learn about some of your challenges with STIG compliance, and we really appreciate this opportunity to be with you today. Thank you.
All righty. And Tony, just a couple of seconds. How about you?
No, thanks for the opportunity. As CISO, I've witnessed firsthand how how we are innovating and working toward hybrid computing, and it has pushed Department of Navy to adapt and innovate to maintain our productivity and security. So I think the future state, as we look ahead, has a lot of potential. We have to continue to work to automate, understand what's our network, understand the threat, and to make sure we're operating as a secure fashion as possible, mitigating risk.
Outstanding. All right. Well, thanks, everybody. This has been great. We could keep on for another hour, I'm sure, but we're flat out of time.
Thanks for listening to Feds at the Edge, the podcast from Fed Insider. Every week we discuss topics that are never off limits or too technical. And don't forget to give us a review and share this podcast with friends.